Okay, 7th grade, so we're reaching the end of our packet here. So we're looking at the pages 60 through 66 today, but we will probably stop about halfway through. I'm not going to be giving any answers today, but I'm going to be helping you think through these questions because this is your overall assessment of what we've talked about throughout the entire packet. So we're going to read this article, The Bone Wars, and then I'm going to walk you through some of the questions. On the Class Dojo post, I'll have what question exactly we go to for today, and then tomorrow we'll finish the second half of the assignment. So, I might have skipped a page. No, I didn't. Okay, we're good. So I'm going to read this article, and then we're going to answer the questions that follow. Again, I'm not going to give you any answers today because this is an assessment, but I will walk you through each of the questions to help you better answer the question. So it's called The Bone Wars by J.R. Hill. It says, if you've spent any time in the grocery checkout lines, you've probably seen magazines with pictures of celebrities behaving badly toward each other. You might believe that scientists would be above that sort of thing, but you'd be wrong. About 150 years ago, two scientists started a nasty feud that lasted for decades and brought to light some of the most spectacular creatures that ever walked the earth. Edward Cope and Othniel Marsh were paleontologists, scientists who study extinct life forms, including dinosaurs. They met in 1864 when their careers were starting. Paleontology was a young science in the United States, and only a few dinosaurs had been discovered in North America. Cope and Marsh were friendly at first, but their relationship quickly soured. In 1868, Cope and a team of hired men were digging up dinosaurs in New Jersey. Marsh journeyed there and stayed with Cope for a few weeks. Things seemed to go well, but after Marsh left, Cope learned that his guest and the team foreman had made a deal. In exchange for money, the foreman would send new fossils to Marsh instead of Cope. Marsh had fired the first shot in what scientists would come to call the Bone Wars. The war heated up fast. In 1869, Cope wrote an article describing a newly found extinct sea reptile he named Elasmosaurus. Okay. Cope included a drawing of the creature's skeleton. Another scientist soon pointed out that Cope had mistakenly stuck the beast's skull on its tail. Cope was humiliated, and Marsh crowed about the blunder to anyone who would listen. Shortly after, each man began publishing a string of scientific articles viciously attacking the other's ideas. Cope and Marsh's thirst to outdo each other spilled into their fieldwork. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, they led and sent teams into lawless regions of the western United States to hunt for dinosaur bones. The teams were told to slow and disrupt each other's work through bribery, stealing, and rock throwing. The teams even used dynamite to blow up cliffs and bury fossils to keep discoveries from falling into each other's hands. To this day, scientists wonder what the fantastic discoveries lay beneath tons of rubble. In addition to sabotage, Cope and Marsh forced their teams to dig up and transport bones quickly. Such speed damaged many specimens, but each man wanted the credit of making the first discoveries of new species. Because they published their findings as quickly as possible, they made many mistakes. Marsh, for example, accidentally stuck the head of one dinosaur onto the neck of another dinosaur and thought he had discovered a new dinosaur, Brontosaurus. Unlike Cope's mistakes with Elasmosaurus, paleontologists didn't discover and undo Marsh's Brontosaurus blunder for nearly 100 years. Until the mid-1880s, only scientists knew about Cope and Marsh's fight. But when Cope rattled out to Marsh to the New York Herald, the battle spilled out into the world at large. Cope and Marsh assaulted each other through letters published in the newspaper. For a time, they were as famous as any celebrities of today, and even when the public eventually stopped caring, the feud didn't cease. The two men of science took swipes at each other until Cope's death in 1897. Even in death, Cope kept up the attack. He donated his skull to science and asked that his brain size be compared to Marsh's. Scientists at the time believed that a person with a large brain was smarter than a person with a small one. For whatever reason, Marsh did not accept Cope's challenge. The Bone Wars have a mixed legacy. On the one hand, American paleontology got a bad reputation from Cope and Marsh's cutthroat behavior, and the mistakes they made in their rush for glory slowed the progress of paleontology for many years. But the Bone Wars also produced a mountain of raw material. Cope and Marsh discovered more than 130 dinosaur species. Their team dug up so many bones that scientists are still learning new things about them. And many of their most famous discoveries, including Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, Diplodocus, and Triceratops, fire the imaginations of children and more than a few adults worldwide. Perhaps paleontology would have been worse off had the two men actually gotten along. So now, as I said, we're going to walk through these questions. We'll probably do all the multiple choice questions today, walk through all of those, and then the short answers we'll walk through together tomorrow. So we're going to go ahead and walk through pages 62 through 64. So here it says, answer parts A and B below. So when it says answer parts A and B, you know that part A is related in some way to part B. So the first part says, the article says that paleontology was a young science in the United States in the mid-1800s. How knowledgeable about the field were paleontologists of the time? So in order to answer this question, we need to think about what young science actually means, right? So we can use kind of context clues to sort of understand that. I mean, we know what science is, right? Well, if it's young, then it's brand new. It's something that not many people have experience with. It's something that is just beginning to be talked about. So the possible answers are, they were more informed than those in other nations. They were the greatest experts of the field at the time. They were not very knowledgeable about their field, or they were just as knowledgeable as any other scientist. When you're thinking about this, you want to keep that idea of young science in mind. It's a new science. It's not something many people have experience with. Specifically paleontology, right? Because it says paleontology was young science. Not that all science was young, not that all fields of science were brand new, but that paleontology was brand new. Not many people had experience with it. So you need to keep that in mind when you're answering part A. When you go to part B, it says which detail from the article best supports your answer to part A. So you want to find, just like when we're doing short answer, how we cite evidence to support our answer, you're wanting to find one of these 4 options they give you that best supports your conclusion to part A. So what evidence from these would you cite if you were writing a short answer question to support your claim in part A? That's what you need to keep in mind when you're doing part B. And again, this is an assessment, so I'm not going to go through the answers, but I will help walk you through the questions. So on 2, it said Marsh and Cope had a stormy relationship. Which event was the most important influence on their relationship? So which of them had the biggest impact on their friendship, because they started out as friends, right? And then something happened that made them no longer friends. So which of these 4 made them no longer friends? Was it that Marsh paid Cope's team foreman to send new fossils to him? Marsh claimed he was the first to discover a mistake by Cope? Groups of their workers threw rocks at each other? Or Cope and Marsh attacked each other in the newspapers? So they started out as friends. Think about which event changed that. Because they started out as friends, they no longer were. What changed that? That's what you need to keep in mind with number 2. So if we go to number 3, it says, which sentence best describes how the 2 paleontologists influenced each other? So, as always, we need to keep that best answer in bold in mind. So when it says best, there might be one answer that's better than the rest. Or maybe all 4 of them make sense, but we need to find the one that is the best. So how did the 2 paleontologists influence each other? How did they change each other's actions, change each other's thoughts? How did they have some sort of say in what each other was doing? Was it because A, Cope and Marsh would do almost anything to become public celebrities? Well, I'll give you a hint. I don't think it had anything to do with them being public celebrities, right? It had more to do with their relationship between each other. So the competition between Cope and Marsh pushed each man to make amazing discoveries. Cope and Marsh's mistakes destroyed their credibility as paleontologists, or Cope and Marsh would have discovered even more dinosaur bones if they had worked together. Okay, so which of these best describes how they influenced each other? Well, I think we can also eliminate D, because the fact that they would have discovered more bones doesn't really have anything to do with how they actually influenced each other. That's just, oh, well, if that wouldn't have happened, this could have been the result. But that doesn't really matter in the question that they're asking here. So 4 says, each man thought he was better in his field than the other. Which evidence from the text best supports the inference that Cope also thought he was smarter than Marsh? So, inference, again, we've talked about inference before. It's when we're assuming something about the text, or we're assuming something about the people in the text. And we do that based on evidence. So which of these pieces of evidence best supports our assumption that Cope also thought he was smarter than Marsh? Because we know Marsh thought he was smarter than Cope, but how do we know Cope thought he was smarter than Marsh? So was it that Cope told the New York Herald about Marsh's actions? I don't really think that has anything to do with him thinking he's smarter necessarily. It has more to do with the fact that he just wanted to make him look bad, right? So we can go ahead and eliminate A. Cope described a newly found extinct sea reptile named Elasmosaurus. C. Cope wanted his brain size compared with Marsh's after death. Remember that back then they thought that if you had a bigger brain, that you were smarter than someone that had a smaller brain. Just something to keep in mind when answering that question. Or was it that Cope published scientific articles viciously attacking Marsh's ideas? So, again, just keeping in mind that we are trying to find the best answer that supports the fact that Cope thought he was smarter than Marsh, and that also, back then, they thought if you had a bigger brain, then you were smarter than everybody else. So the fact that he wanted his brain size compared to the other guys might be important. 5 says, a good summary includes only important details. Which of the following details is not important enough to include in a summary of the article? This is kind of important when we're thinking about central idea and all those kinds of things that we've discussed before. When you're doing a summary, you're not including those little details that don't really matter to the whole story. So if you're telling a story about some crazy thing that happened to you, does it really matter that you had a pink shirt on? No, that's not an important detail in the summary of what happened. So your options for what is not important enough to include in the summary is the rival between Cope and Marsh affected their fieldwork. I'm going to tell you right now that's pretty important. I would say you should probably keep that one in. So I'm going to go ahead and circle it because it's one that you should keep in mind, not one that you should take away. So the rivalry between Cope and Marsh affected their fieldwork. Cope and Marsh brought to light some amazing discoveries. Each man's rush to claim glory caused mistakes to be made. I would say that's probably also a good answer. And the men gained fame due to their letters in the New York Herald. So which is not important? So which one? We already know A and C are important. So between B and D, which is not important enough to include in a summary of the article? That's what you need to figure out. So last two, we're going to look at 6 and 7, and then tomorrow we'll look at the short answer and the kind of essay question at the end. 6 says, the last paragraph says that the Bone Wars have a mixed legacy. How does the author develop this idea? First of all, what does a mixed legacy mean? Well, we know a legacy is like how something is thought about later on, right? So if you die and you leave a legacy, it's what people will talk about after it's long gone, right? After you're long gone, what are people going to have to say about you? So what are people saying about the Bone Wars now that they've happened a long time ago? They're not happening anymore. So in the paragraph it says that they have a mixed legacy. That would mean, if it's mixed, that would mean that people disagree on whether it was good or bad, whether it has a good legacy or a bad legacy. So our options for how the author develops this idea is by concentrating on the mistakes that Cope and Marsh made, by presenting the pros and cons of Cope and Marsh's rivalry, by giving the cause and effects of Cope and Marsh's rivalry, or by stating in sequence events detailing Cope and Marsh's rivalry. So if we're looking at the fact that they had a mixed legacy, would we want to be concentrating just on the mistakes? No, because that wouldn't give us the mixed legacy. It would just be one legacy. If we look at D, it says by stating in sequence events. What sequence events means is it means in the order that it happened. Does that have anything to do with a mixed legacy? No. So we know our two options are, was it through presenting the pros and cons of the rivalry, or was it by giving cause and effect? So pros and cons would be, these are the good things that came out of the Bone Wars, and these are the bad things that came out of the Bone Wars. That would be the pros and cons. The cause and effect would be, Cope did this, so therefore Marsh did this. Or Marsh did this, therefore Cope did this. So it's just showing you this action led to this other action by this second person, or this action led to this result. Whereas B is talking about, here's the good things that happen and here's the bad things that happen, kind of giving you two sides of the story. A mixed side of the story, you could say. Just a little hint. So 7 says, which of the following lists only the main topics of the Bone Wars in correct order? The best way I would say that you could answer this question is, and I'm going to let you do this on your own because I think you guys need a little bit of practice with it. Go back through and read the story and maybe make a bulleted list in order of what Cope and Marsh did. Because here it's asking you to give the main topics of the story in the correct order. So if we find a couple to delete, this would be like making a timeline of what they should tell you in the story, is basically what you're doing. So if we look at C, it says the feud turns Cope and Marsh into celebrities. Well, I think they skipped a little bit there, right? Because I didn't even know there was a feud, and now they're telling me the feud turned them into celebrities. Well, what feud are you talking about? Right? So I think we can go ahead and eliminate C. That's the only one I'm going to eliminate for you because I want you guys to really make that list yourselves. So we need to go through, read back the story on page 60 and 61, and while you're reading it, make a timeline or a bulleted list of the most important things, the main topics of what happened, and then compare your list to theirs. Or you can reread it and check off the list and make sure that they list the main topics in their version of the events. So like I said, you guys just need to complete these questions on page 62 through 64. Tomorrow we will go through 65 and 66 together. So you just need to be doing those 3 pages worth of questions. So if you guys have questions on those, I can't give you any answers because again, this is our assessment. But if you have need any more explanation of the questions, you can get with me during office hours.